Trap Lake lay in the north of Kewaskum County like a coin dropped into a pocket of tamarack and marsh, and for as long as anyone in Dunmore Township could remember, the best money that Lake ever made came out of it in winter in blocks on a sled. In summer, it was only water. In January, it was a crop. The creamery at Dunmore Center could not hold a pound of butter through a July week without ice, and the meat market at Kewaskum could not hang a quarter of beef, and the hotel could not set a cold table, and the berry shippers down at the depot could not load a single crate for Milwaukee unless the car was bunkered full at both ends. Ice was not a luxury in that country. Ice was the difference between a thing sold and a thing spoiled, and every family on the shore of Trap Lake understood that the water lying flat and black under the window in November was going to be worth cash money by the middle of February if the winter did its work. The winter usually did. The rule in Dunmore Township, and it was a good rule, honestly arrived at over 40 years of cutting, was that a man waited. He waited until after the new year. He waited until the sheet had made its full thickness and gone hard and blue and clear the whole way down, and that meant 14 inches at the least and 16 if he could get it, and he did not touch the lake before that, no matter how his hands itched. Thin ice was a fool's harvest. A cake sawed at 8 inches weighed half what a cake sawed at 16 weighed, and it carried twice the surface for the weight it did carry, and every square foot of surface was a place for the summer to get in. Thin cakes broke on the ramp. Thin cakes candled in the pile, went gray, and stood up in loose needles like a scrubbed broom. And by the 4th of July, a house filled with them was a house full of dirty water and floating sawdust. Everybody knew it. Elmer Stack had said it 1,000 times at the feed store, and Elmer Stack held the ice contract for the creamery and for the village of Dunmore Center both. And the contract he held said in plain print that no cake under 14 inches would be received or paid for. Stack was a big man of about 55, heavy through the chest, red in the face from 40 winters on open water, with a thick, sandy gray mustache and a way of hooking his thumbs in his coat pockets when he was about to explain something to you. He was not a cruel man, and it would be a lie to call him one. He was a man who was right about ice, and had been right about ice for a long time, and had made a comfortable living out of being right about it. There is a particular kind of laughter that comes out of a man like that when somebody with no standing at all does the exact opposite of what he has always said. It is not hatred. In a small township, it is worse than hatred, because it is amusement. And amusement travels farther than anger and lasts longer, and it gets into the schoolhouse and onto the church steps and into the back of the store where the men sit on the nail kegs. Once a thing has become funny, it is very hard for anybody to look at it straight again. The thing that became funny in the December of 1905 was Orpha Denning. She was 62 years old that winter. She was a short woman, broad through the shoulders and heavy through the arms from a lifetime of pumping and hauling and kneading and lifting, with a wide, plain, weathered face, pale blue-gray eyes set deep under heavy brows, and iron-gray hair parted in the middle and pinned in a low, tight knot that never came loose in any wind. She wore a dark brown wool work dress buttoned to the throat, a coarse cream apron over it, a black shawl crossed and pinned at the back, and heavy black boots that had been resoled twice. She was not a picturesque woman. Nobody had ever printed a word about her in the county paper except the 2 lines when her husband died. She had 60 acres on the north shore of Trap Lake, 40 of them in oats and hay and 20 in stumps and marsh, a note at the bank in Kewaskum with 2 years still to run on it, and a garden that fed her and, in a good year, fed the parsonage as well, because she took no money for anything that came out of a garden and never had. Her husband had been Silas Denning, and Silas had been an iceman. Not a contractor, nothing so grand as Elmer Stack. He had been a farmer who cut ice, which in that township was most of what a man was in January, and he had cut it off the north bar where the water ran shallow and the ice made early and clear. In the year 1884, he had built an ice house on the rise above the landing, a double-walled building of tamarack and pine 40 feet long and 24 wide, with a cobble floor laid over a tile drain so that meltwater ran away downhill instead of standing in the pile, with a ventilator cut into the peak of the roof and screened against the wind, and with a door no wider than a man and his load set on the north side under the shade of the bank. He had built it for the creamery when the creamery was new and had no ice of its own, and for 11 winters the Denning house had filled the creamery's boxes. Then the creamery grew, and Stack came with a crew of 20 men and a steam elevator, and the contract went where contracts go. Silas had not complained. He had gone on filling his house every January anyway, selling to whoever wanted a hundredweight, and he had gone on writing in his book. The book was the thing. It was a paper-covered ledger, foolscap ruled, with a cracked marbled cover and a strip of black cloth tape along the spine that Orpha had mended twice, and it held 33 winters. Silas had begun it as a young man in 1872 and had written in it every winter until the autumn of 1896, when he died in the barn with a fork in his hand at 54 years of age. And after that, Orpha had gone on writing in it, because it never occurred to her to stop. In it, in his cramped upright hand, and then in her round slow one, was the whole life of that lake. The day the bays first skimmed, the day the sheet closed over the middle, the thickness at the north bar measured every Sunday with a marked stick through a chopped hole, the day of the first thaw, and how long it held, the day the ice went out in the spring and the wind that took it, the number of cakes housed, the size of the cake, the price got at the house, the price got delivered, and what was still standing in the house on the 1st of September. It was not a diary. There was nothing in it about weddings or funerals or hard words. It was a book about water and cold, kept by a man who had understood that the two of them together were the only bank account a poor farm on that shore was ever going to have. And in 33 winters that book said one thing 3 times, and Orpha Denning had read those 3 entries so often that she could have recited them with her eyes shut. In 1878 the lake had not skimmed until the 29th of November, 3 weeks late. In 1889 it had not skimmed until the 2nd of December. In 1895 it had not skimmed until the 4th. And in each of those 3 winters, the January that followed came in warm and wet and never turned back. The sheet made and broke and made and broke. Rain fell on it. The middle never went hard. The harvest failed outright, and in each of those 3 summers the ice that Kewaskum County used came down from 160 miles north in a boxcar at 4 and 5 times the price, when it could be got at all. In 1895 it could not be got at all after the middle of July, and 200 pounds of the creamery's butter went rancid on the platform waiting for a car that never came bunkered. 3 times in 33 winters. A late lake meant an open winter. It was not a superstition, and it was not a sign. It was a thing a man had written down while it was happening, because he wrote everything down, and it sat there on the ruled paper being true whether anybody believed it or not. It is worth saying at the front what that old ledger was about to be worth, because this is not a story that needs a mystery kept in it. In 11 days of the December of 1905, off 8-inch ice that the whole township told her to her face was worthless. Orpha Denning housed 340 tons, and the county laughed at her for it from the store steps to the schoolhouse door. Then the January that followed came in warm and wet and never turned back, and not one merchantable ton of ice was cut in Kewaskum County in the winter of 1906. Hers was the only ice standing between the Sable River and the county line. She sold it through the summer that came after at a price she set once and refused to raise, and when she added the columns in October, it came to $2,730, which was more than the Denning place had earned in the 9 years since her husband died. What follows is how that happened, and how long it took a township to stop laughing. In the autumn of 1905, the tamaracks around Trap Lake held their needles into the first week of November, which was late. The marsh did not stiffen. Warm rain came out of the southwest all through the middle of the month, and the roads stayed soft past Thanksgiving. And the shallow bays that ordinarily bore a boy's weight by the 20th of November lay open and black and rocking under the wind. Orpha Denning walked down to the landing every morning of that November with a marked stick in her hand and walked back up with nothing to write. On the first day of December she wrote, in her round, slow hand, that the bays had skimmed at last, 3 weeks and 2 days behind the average of 33 years, and afterward she sat a long while at the kitchen table, with the lamp turned up and the book open in front of her, looking at 3 old entries in her dead husband's handwriting. On the 8th of December, the ice at the north bar measured 7 inches. On the 11th, it measured 8, and it was clear ice, black ice, hard as a plate and so transparent that a person standing on it could see the sand ripples and the dark weed beds 2 feet down and had to trust her feet against her eyes. On the morning of the 11th, Orpha Denning walked into Vollmer's store at Dunmore Center, took $42 out of the tin box she carried inside her coat, and hired 4 men to cut ice for her, beginning the next morning at $1.25 a day, paid a week in advance. That was the whole of the offense, and it is worth saying plainly why the township took it as one. Because a stranger hearing the story afterward always wants to know why grown people would laugh at a widow for filling her own ice house on her own lake with her own money. The first reason was the thickness. 8 inches was not harvest ice. Every man in that store had been raised on the arithmetic of it, and Elmer Stack stated the arithmetic out loud from the nail keg by the stove while she was counting out the money, not unkindly, in the voice of a man doing a neighbor a service. A cake sawed at 8 inches, he said, gave you half the weight and twice the wasting surface of a cake sawed at 16. It would break under the tongs. It would break on the ramp. It would candle in the pile by June and go to gray needles and then to water, and she would spend the winter and her cash and her back hauling a lake up a hill so that it could run out from under her door in July. He said the creamery's own contract would not take a cake under 14 inches, and that was not spite, that was in the paper, and any man there could read it. The second reason was the money, and the money was what made it more than an argument. $42 in Dunmore Township in 1905 was not a small sum for a woman on 60 acres with a note at the bank. It was her whole year's garden and needlework money, the seed money for spring, the money that ought to have gone against the note or into boots. She paid it out in advance, in December, to 4 men she did not have to hire, for a job the whole county was about to do properly in 4 or 5 weeks, and she paid it for ice that nobody in the county believed would last past haying. There is nothing a farming township understands more sharply than a neighbor spending money she has not got, and nothing it forgives more slowly. The third reason was the sawdust. On the 14th of December, she began hauling sawdust from the Ockert Mill on the Sable River, which had shut down in October when the pine gave out, and where the sawdust hill behind the burner stood 2 stories high and had been standing there rotting and steaming quietly for 19 years. Old man Ockert let her have it for nothing, and thanked her for taking it, and told her to take the whole hill if she liked, and to bring back the wheelbarrow. She took 60 loads. 60 loads of mill trash up the township road past every farm gate in 6 days, so that people came out on their porches to watch it go by and then went back in and told each other about it. She packed that sawdust a full foot deep into the double walls of the ice house. She laid it a foot deep on the cobble floor. She meant to lay it 2 feet deep over the top of the whole pile when the pile was made. And to any man who had ever housed ice this looked like exactly one thing, which was a woman who knew her ice was bad and was trying to bury it deep enough to keep the fact from coming out. Packing rot and rot, Stack called it. The phrase got around the township in a day and a half, the way a good phrase does. The fourth reason was that she had turned down a cash offer 3 weeks before in front of witnesses. Stack had come up to the Denning place in the middle of November with an eye on the ice house itself. It was well built, and it was standing on a good landing, and he wanted the tamarack out of it. and he offered her $25 for the building to be torn down and hauled off in the spring, which for a widow with an empty ice house and a note at the bank was not a bad offer, and he said as much. She told him no. She did not argue with him, and she did not explain herself, which people held against her more than a refusal, because an explanation would at least have given them something to chew on. She said the house was Silas's house and it would stand, and she thanked him for coming, and she went back into the kitchen. Stack drove out of the yard, and by the following Sunday it was known from the church steps to the depot that the Denning widow had refused good money for a building she had no ice to put in. So when the four men went out onto the north bar on the 12th of December with hand saws and spuds and marking irons, the township had its story already assembled and only needed to watch it play. Men drove out from the center on purpose. Boys came down after school and stood on the bank in a row with their hands in their sleeves. Somebody from the county paper came as far as the landing, looked at the 8-inch cakes coming up out of the black water, and went away again without writing anything, which was its own kind of verdict. Orpha Denning did not answer any of it. This has to be understood about her, because it is the part people got wrong for years afterward. She was not defiant. She was not making a point. She was a woman who had read a book kept by a man who did not lie, and the book said that 3 times out of 33 the lake came late and the winter never closed, and the lake had come 3 weeks and 2 days late. She had 8 inches of hard black ice under her feet in December, and she did not believe on the evidence in her own kitchen that she was going to be offered 16 inches of blue ice in January. So she took what the lake had while the lake had it, and she took it with hired hands, because she was 62 years old and had reckoned honestly what her own 2 arms could do in 11 days. And she spent the seed money, because seed money is only worth what it buys. She said one thing about it, once, and only because Cordelia Mapes asked her straight out. Cordelia was the widow across the township road, a tall, thin woman of about 60 with white hair under a black bonnet, who had known her 30 years and had earned the right to ask. She came into the kitchen on the second evening of the cutting, out of the cold, and sat down and said that people were saying hard things, and that some of them were saying she had gone strange in her grief, and that she ought to know it. Orpha put the coffee down in front of her and opened the ledger on the oilcloth and turned it around so that it faced her guest, and put one thick weathered finger on the entry for the 2nd of December, 1889, and moved it across the ruled line to the column at the far side, where in Silas Denning's cramped up right hand it said that the harvest had failed, that no cake had been housed in the township that year, and that ice had sold in Kewaskum in August for $9 the ton, freight paid, when it could be got. Cordelia Mapes read it twice. Then she asked what the entry for 1878 said, and Orpha turned back the leaves and showed her, and then she showed her 1895, and the 2 women sat there in the lamplight over an old ledger for the better part of an hour, while the cold came down outside and the lake 3 weeks and 2 days late lay under 8 inches of black glass. In the morning, Cordelia Mapes came down to the landing in her boots with her sleeves pinned up and worked 11 days for nothing, and when she was asked about it in church, she said only that she had seen the book. The cutting took 11 days, and it was done the old way, by hand, because there was no crew of 20 and no steam elevator on the north bar, only 4 hired men, 2 widows, and a boy from the Pruitt place who came down on his own after the 2nd day and would not take wages. They swept the snow off first. That was the first thing, and the most important thing, and Orpha Denning was strict about it in a way that puzzled the hired men until they saw the reason. Snow left lying on a sheet acts as a blanket, and the water under a blanket does not go on freezing hard and clear. It freezes slushy and white and full of air, and that is snow ice, and snow ice is half the strength and twice the wasting of the black ice below it. So they swept, and they swept every fall of snow off the working field for 11 days, and what they cut was clear ice the whole way down. Then they marked. The marking iron was Silas Denning's, a straight-toothed hand marker on a wooden stock, and they ran it up and down the swept field against a chalked line and a plank, scoring the surface into a grid of squares 22 inches on the side, so that every cake would come out the same size and would stack against its neighbors without a gap. Uniformity was not vanity. A pile of ice keeps by touching itself. Air is what ruins a pile, and every irregular cake makes a channel for air to move in, and every channel that air can move in is a place where a summer can walk into a building and eat. Then they saw it. A one-man ice saw is 6 feet of steel with teeth 2 inches deep and a handle like a crutch, and a person works it standing, straight down through the scored line, and the cold water comes up over the boot tops with every stroke. The 4 hired men sawed the field into long floats. The women broke the floats into cakes with the chisel bar and steered them down the open channel to the foot of the ramp with pike poles, walking them along like a raft of squared timber. At the ramp, the cakes came up out of the water on a plank slide, one at a time, hooked and hauled hand over hand with tongs, and were slid onto a low wooden sled and taken up the rise to the ice house door on the north side under the bank. Inside, the packing was where the winter was won, and the packing was Silas Dennings, learned out of 33 winters and written down in the back of the book in a list of 9 numbered lines. A foot of sawdust on the cobble floor first, spread level. The first course of cakes set tight, cake to cake, with the joints broken like brickwork, and every gap between cake and cake filled with shaved snow ice, tamped in with a shovel handle so that the whole course froze into one body by morning. Never a cake against the wall. A clear foot of sawdust between the ice and the wall on every side, all the way up, filled in as the courses rose. No air. That was the whole of it, said the 9th line of the list in the cramped upright hand. Air is the thief. Shut out the air, and the sun cannot get in the door. They laid up 16 courses. The cakes were 8 inches at the start of the cutting and 9.5 by the last day, because the cold had come at last, and it came hard and dry and stayed for 11 days as if to make a fool of her twice over. Men on the bank said so out loud. Wait a fortnight, they told her, and you will have your 16 inches like a Christian. She went on sawing 8-inch ice. On the 23rd of December, the last course went in, and they laid 2 full feet of Ockert's sawdust over the top of the pile and swept the walls down and left the ventilator open at the peak, and Orpha Denning shut the little north door and battened it and hung the tongs on their nail, and the ice house on the rise above the landing held 340 tons of clear December ice that not one person in Kewaskum County wanted, believed in, or would have paid $1 for. The township enjoyed it thoroughly. It went on enjoying it through the holidays. At the Christmas program in the schoolhouse, a boy got a laugh out of half the room with a recitation about a snowbank in a barn. And it was not meant to be cruel, and the boy did not know why the grown people laughed the way they did. And Orpha Denning sat in the 3rd row in her black shawl and laughed politely along with everybody else, because she had been 62 years in a small township and knew that the fastest way to be talked about for another year is to look wounded. Denning's snowbank, the men called it at the store. Somebody said she had buried her seed money under 2 feet of mill trash where the mice could not get at it. Elmer Stack, who was not a cruel man, said at the feed store on the 28th of December that he would buy the whole houseful in August at $1 the ton, sight unseen, and the store laughed, and he laughed, and he meant it as a kindness, in the way a strong man means a joke as a kindness. That offer was remembered afterward with great exactness by everyone who heard it. And then the lake never froze again. The warm rain came out of the southwest on the 2nd of January, and it did not stop, and the sheet that Elmer Stack was waiting to cut at 14 inches went out of Trap Lake in the 2nd week of the new year, and never once in the whole of that winter made harvest ice again. It made and broke 5 times. It made gray, rotten snow ice that a pike pole went through. Not 1 ton of merchantable ice was housed in Kewaskum County in the winter of 1906, not by Stack with his crew of 20 and his steam elevator, Not by the creamery, not by the village, not by any farmer on any lake in 4 townships. And when the summer came in hot at the end of May, the only ice standing between the Sable River and the county line was 340 tons of 8-inch December ice, packed cake to cake with no air in it, under 2 feet of sawmill trash, in a double-walled tamarack building that a man had built in 1884 and that his widow had refused to sell for $25. What is worth the telling is the rest of it. How a county goes about discovering that it was wrong, how long that takes, what it costs while it is happening, and what a plain old woman does with a whole township standing in her yard in July with money in its hand. It began with rain. On the 2nd of January 1906, the wind came round into the southwest, and it rained on Trap Lake for a day and a night, and it went on raining warm off and on for 11 days. The ice at the North Bar, 12 inches by then, and coming along beautifully, took the rain on its back and went gray. Water stood on it in sheets. The creeks ran and pushed brown water under the sheet from below, and the wind got a purchase on it and worked it. And on the 9th of January, the middle of the lake opened with a sound that people 2 miles inland said they heard in their kitchens, and by the 11th Trap Lake was black open water rocking under a warm wind in the middle of January with the tamaracks dripping on the shore. Nobody panicked in January. That is not how it goes. A township that has cut ice for 40 years has seen a January thaw before and knows perfectly well that a thaw is followed by a freeze, and the men at the store said what men say, which was that the lake would take hold again by Candlemas and make its 14 inches in 3 cold weeks, and everybody would cut late and think no more about it. Elmer Stack said it with the most confidence of anybody, because he had the most to lose by any other opinion. He had 80 men promised, 4 houses to fill, a contract with the creamery and a contract with the village, and a standing order from the meat market at Kewaskum, and he had already paid down on a new steam elevator that was sitting in a shed at the depot in 3 crates. The lake took hold on the 22nd of January and made 4 inches, and then it rained again. It took hold on the 4th of February and made 6, and a warm wind came up on the 9th, and the sheet broke into cakes the size of parlor rugs and ground itself to slush against the shore. It took hold at the end of February and gave them, at last, on the 12th of March, an honest-looking sheet of 9.5 inches, and Stack put 20 men on it in a hurry and cut for 1 day. What came up out of the water was gray. It had made in 3 separate freezes with snow between the layers, and it was snow ice the whole depth, honeycombed and soft, and the cakes came apart on the slide and slumped on the ramp, and a pike pole went into one of them like a fork into a boiled potato. He housed 190 tons of it because a man must do something with 80 promised men. And by the middle of May, every ton of it had run out from under the doors of his 4 houses and gone down the hill in a gray stream, and the floors were bare and stinking of wet sawdust. And that was the harvest of 1906 in Kewaskum County. The county did not understand what that meant until the weather told it. April was cool, and nobody thought about ice in April. The first hot week came at the end of May, and it came all at once, 5 days over 90 degrees with the wind out of the south, and the creamery at Dunmore Center found itself with 1,600 pounds of butter in the churn room and nothing to cool it with. Alton Ferris, who was the butter maker and manager, a spare man of about 40 with wire spectacles and thin brown hair, drove to Kewaskum and found that there was no ice for sale in Kewaskum. He telegraphed north and learned what everybody in the state was learning that week, which was that the open winter had not been merely local. The whole lower half of the state had failed. Ice was being shipped down from the far north at $9 the ton with the freight paid, and there were no refrigerator cars to be had at any price because the breweries and the packers had taken them all in April, and the earliest promise anyone would give him was the 2nd week of July. On the morning of the 29th of May, Alton Ferris drove out the township road to the north shore of Trap Lake, past the 60 acres of oats and hay, and stopped in Orpha Denning's yard, and stood in front of a small north-facing door battened shut since the 23rd of December, and took his hat off, which was the part of the story he told on himself for the rest of his life. She got the bar and knocked the battens off, and they pulled the door. And the cold came out of that building and rolled over their boots and stood in the sunlight in a low white fog, the way it does out of a well. Inside, under 2 feet of Ockert sawdust that they scraped back with a wooden shovel, the pile stood 16 courses high and shoulder to shoulder, wall to wall, with a clear foot of packed sawdust all around it. And the cakes were not candled, and they were not gray, and they had not gone to needles. They had frozen together in the first week of January into one single body of ice 40 feet long and 24 wide, so solid that the men had to cut it out again with the saws in blocks as though they were quarrying stone. And when the first block came out into the daylight, and Ferris put his hand flat on the sawn face, it was hard and clear, and it rang a little under his knuckles. And it had lost, in 5 months and 6 days, something under 1/5 of its weight. Ferris asked her what she wanted for it. He had come out prepared to pay a great deal, because he had a creamery full of butter and a market 3 days away and nothing else in the county to buy, and he said afterward that he had $12 the ton in his head and would have gone to 15 without blinking. Orpha Denning stood in the cold fog at her own door with the sawdust to her boot tops and said $8 the ton at the house, and the same price to the next man, and the same price in August as in June, and she would put it in writing if he liked. It was the plainest business she ever did, and the whole county talked about it for a generation. $8 the ton was a fine price, 4 or 5 times what ice fetched at the house in an ordinary year, and nobody who ever told the story pretended she gave it away. But it was well under what the North Country was charging with the freight on, and it did not move a penny all summer. Not in the last week of July, when a hotel man from 2 counties over came up the road with a roll of bills and offered her $22 the ton for everything still standing, and not when Elmer Stack himself, who had 80 men and 4 empty houses and a contract he could not fill, came into the yard in the 2nd week of June with his hat in his hand and asked to buy ice from her to keep his own word to the village. She sold to Stack at $8 the ton, the same as everyone. She did not make a speech about it. She wrote it in the book. That summer the sledding to the North Bar Landing ran the other way for the first time in the history of the township, up the hill empty and down the hill loaded. The creamery took 140 tons through June, July, and August and shipped its butter and did not lose a pound of it. The Rennick House Hotel at Kewaskum and Kling's Meat Market and the berry shippers at the depot took another 90 between them, and the berry crop of 1906 went out of Kewaskum County in bunkered cars when 3 counties around could not load at all, which is a thing the growers remembered a long time. The rest went by the hundredweight off a wagon that Ansel Pruitt drove, a wiry young man of about 24 in a tan canvas coat, who ran a route 6 days a week through Dunmore Center and out along the section roads, and came back at noon for a second load, and who was paid 1/3 of what he sold, and bought 40 acres of his own out of that one summer, and a good deal of it never got weighed at all. Dr. Merle Vanasse had a fever ward of 11 beds over the drug store at Kewaskum in the hot last week of July, and he had ice from the Denning house for all of them, and he was never allowed to pay for a pound of it, and neither was any house in the township with sickness in it. There was a rule about it by the middle of June, and Ansel Pruitt knew the rule and did not have to ask. Ice for a sick house was free. Ice for a funeral was free, and there were 2 that summer. Ice for the school picnic was free, and for the church social, and for the 2 hired girls at the parsonage who came down with a tub on the handles of a wheelbarrow and went away with it heaped and covered in a wet sack. The rest of the county paid $8 the ton, and the ledger in the kitchen filled up with names in a round, slow hand. They finished the pile on the 14th of September, and there was nothing left in the house but wet sawdust and a cold smell. When Orpha Denning added the columns in October, the total was $2,730. She had paid out $69 in wages in December, and about $14 more for hauling the sawdust. And she gave the 4 hired men who had cut for her in the cold $25 apiece in October, which none of them had asked for, and one of them tried to refuse. She paid off the note at the bank in Kewaskum, which had 2 years still to run and had been the first thing she thought of every morning for 7 years. She had the ice house re-roofed and the walls opened and repacked, and had a second house built beside it the same size, and had the ramp rebuilt in plank with an iron edge. She bought 2 new saws, 4 pairs of tongs, a marking iron, and a pair of boots. And she took the paper-covered ledger with the cracked marbled cover and the mended cloth tape to a bookbinder at Kewaskum and had it bound in plain brown leather with nothing stamped on the cover, and had 100 blank leaves sewn in at the back for the winters that were coming. The following December the whole township watched the lake. That is not a figure of speech. On the 4th of December 1906, which was an ordinary early winter with the bays skimmed on the 11th of November like any other year, men who had laughed on the nail kegs came down to the North Bar Landing to see what Orpha Denning would do. And when she did not come down, and went on husking corn on the ridge instead, they understood that the book had told her to wait. And they waited, and in the second week of January 1907 they cut 16-inch blue ice off Trap Lake exactly the way their fathers had, and filled every house in 4 townships, and the price fell back to $1.50 at the house where it belonged. It never happened again in her lifetime either. 3 times in 33 winters had become 4 times in 34, and that was all it was. But the book was read after that. Men asked her about the lake, and she told them what was written, and did not embroider it. Elmer Stack, who was not a cruel man, and who had lost a great deal of money and a great deal more standing in the winter of 1906, came up the township road one evening late in that next autumn, and asked her, straight out and with the thumbs nowhere near his coat pockets, what the book said about the coming winter. She told him it said nothing, because the lake had skimmed on time, and a lake that skims on time is only a lake. He took his hat off in the yard and thanked her and drove home, and after that the 2 of them cut on the same bar for 9 winters, and there was never a word about it between them. She was buried in the Dunmore churchyard in 1921 at 77 years of age, and the ice house that a man had built in 1884 stood on the rise above the landing for another 30 years after that, and was still standing, roofless and full of alder brush, when the last of the people who had laughed on the 12th of December were themselves old. The county was never able to decide afterward whether what she had done was luck or judgment, and argued about it comfortably for years. It was neither, and the answer was on the oilcloth of her kitchen table the whole time, and a cramped upright hand and a round slow one. Somebody had written down what the water did every winter for 33 winters, and somebody else had believed him.